John scratched lines on the wall. Another day gone. Each mark represented a day of his life lost to the darkness, a tally of time that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls of his cell were his only companions, silent witnesses to his slow descent into madness. Another day closer to death, maybe. Or perhaps just another day closer to losing his mind completely. The isolation gnawed at him, a relentless beast that fed on his sanity. He often wondered if death would be a release, a final escape from the torment that had become his existence. The air hung heavy, thick with despair and the stench of sweat and fear. It was a miasma that clung to his skin, seeped into his lungs, and filled his mind with dread. The cell was a living entity, breathing with him, suffocating him with its oppressive presence. The only light came from a single flickering bulb high above, casting long, dancing shadows. Those shadows seemed to mock him, their erratic movements a cruel reminder of the life and freedom he once had. The bulb's intermittent glow was a cruel joke, offering just enough light to see his misery, but never enough to dispel the darkness. The Hole. That's what they called it. A fitting name for a place designed to break a man's spirit, to strip away his humanity, until nothing remained but a hollow shell. It was a place where hope came to die, where dreams were crushed under the weight of despair. Buried deep beneath the earth, it was a place forgotten by the sun, by hope, by God himself. The world above was a distant memory, a fading dream that seemed more like a cruel illusion with each passing day. Down here in the bowels of the earth, time lost all meaning. John often wondered if the world above even existed anymore. Had it changed while he was entombed in this living grave? Did people still laugh, love, and live their lives, oblivious to the suffering that lay hidden beneath their feet? Had it all been swallowed whole, just like him? The thought haunted him, a spectre that refused to be banished. He imagined the world above as a barren wasteland, consumed by the same darkness that enveloped him. It was a bleak vision, but it was all he had left. Years he'd spent down here, years that had blurred together into an endless nightmare. The days, weeks, months, and years were indistinguishable, a monotonous cycle of suffering and despair. He had become a ghost, a shadow of the man he once was. He'd lost count, lost track of time itself. The concept of time had become meaningless, a cruel joke in a place where every second felt like an eternity. His mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting 1,000 broken images of his past, present, and future. His crime? He couldn't remember, or maybe he chose not to. The details of his past were a blur, lost in the fog of his tortured mind. All that remained were fragments, disjointed memories that offered no solace, no answers, or maybe he just didn't want to. Some things were better left forgotten, buried deep within the recesses of his mind. The past was a painful place, filled with regrets and mistakes that he could never undo. Some memories were best left buried. They were like ghosts, haunting him with their whispers, their accusations. He had learned to silence them, to push them down into the depths of his soul where they could no longer hurt him. His cell was small, cramped, a cage for a broken animal. It was a place designed to strip away his humanity, to reduce him to nothing more than a caged beast. The walls closed in on him, a constant reminder of his captivity. The walls were damp, the floor cold and unforgiving. It was a place devoid of comfort, of warmth. The chill seeped into his bones, a constant reminder of his isolation. The cell was a tomb, a place where the living were buried alive. The only sounds were the drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the frantic beating of his own heart. It was a symphony of despair, a constant reminder of his solitude. The silence was deafening, a void that threatened to consume him whole. One day a new prisoner arrived. Old Sal, they called him. He was different. His eyes, though filled with the same despair, still held a spark, a glint of defiance. He spoke of a legend, a whisper among the prisoners. A way out, a ventilation shaft, hidden, almost forgotten. Too small for most men, but not for John. He was wiry, toughened by years of hardship. Hope, a dangerous thing in this place, flickered within him. Sal had a plan. Desperate, dangerous, but a plan nonetheless. It involved a makeshift rope, a loose grate, and a whole lot of luck. John listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's suicide!" another prisoner rasped from the shadows. "They'll catch you and then—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. John swallowed hard. He knew the risks, but the thought of dying in this hole, forgotten and alone, was even more terrifying. The air crackled with tension. Tonight was the night. The night they had been planning for months. Every detail meticulously thought out, every possible scenario considered. John and Sal had spent countless sleepless nights whispering in the dark, their minds racing with the possibilities and the risks. They knew the stakes were high, but the thought of freedom was too intoxicating to ignore. John could feel it in his bones. The anxiety gnawed at him, but so did the determination. He had to stay focused, had to keep his mind sharp. There was no room for error. He glanced at Sal, who was equally tense, his eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail, every shadow. He gripped the rope Sal had made, his palms slick with sweat. The rope was their lifeline, their only chance of making it out. It had taken weeks to gather the materials and fashion it into something strong enough to hold their weight. John could feel the rough texture of the rope digging into his skin, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The plan was simple, but fraught with danger. They had to move quickly and quietly, timing their actions perfectly to avoid detection. Every step had been rehearsed, every movement choreographed. But no plan was foolproof, and the margin for error was razor-thin. They had to trust each other completely, their lives hanging in the balance. One wrong move, one misstep, and it would all be over. The thought sent a shiver down John's spine. He had to push the fear aside, had to focus on the task at hand. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant echoes of the prison. The guard's footsteps echoed in the distance. They had memorized the guard's patrol schedule, knowing exactly when he would pass by. Timing was everything. They had to wait for the perfect moment, the brief window of opportunity when the guard's back was turned. It was a game of patience and nerves, each second stretching into an eternity. John took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his senses heightened. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. He had to stay calm, had to keep his wits about him. There was no room for panic, no time for second-guessing. He glanced at Sal, who offered a silent nod, his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. This was it. They had come too far to turn back now. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. They were in this together, for better or worse. The moment the guard's back was turned, John made his move. He sprang into action, his body moving on instinct. There was no time to think, only to act. Every second counted. Every movement had to be precise. He could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of their situation pressing down on him. He scrambled up onto the toilet, his heart pounding in his ears. The small cell felt even more confining, the walls closing in around him. He had to move quickly, had to stay ahead of the guard's return. The sound of his own breathing was loud in his ears, a constant reminder of the urgency of their escape. He reached for the loose grate, his fingers trembling. This was the moment of truth. The grate was their way out, their path to freedom. But it was also a potential trap, a point of no return. He had to steady his hands, had to focus on the task at hand. There was no room for error, no margin for mistake. It creaked ominously as he pried it open. The sound seemed to echo in the small cell, a reminder of the fragility of their plan. He had to move quickly, had to get through the opening before the guard returned. The darkness beyond the grate was both terrifying and inviting, a promise of freedom and the unknown. He squeezed through the opening, the metal scraping against his skin. The tight space was claustrophobic, the air thick with dust and the stench of decay, but he pushed through, driven by the promise of freedom. Every movement was a struggle, every inch gained a victory. He could feel the rough metal against his skin, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The darkness swallowed him whole, the air thick with dust and the stench of decay. The tunnel was narrow and confining, a labyrinth of metal and shadows. But it was their way out, their path to freedom. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the guard's return. The darkness was both a friend and an enemy, hiding them from view but also obscuring their path. He could hear Sal right behind him, his laboured breathing echoing in the confined space. They were in this together, their fates intertwined. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. They had to trust each other completely, their lives hanging in the balance. There was no turning back now. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers unknown. But they had come too far to turn back. The promise of freedom was too intoxicating, the thought of escape too powerful. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the guard's return. The darkness was their ally, the shadows their refuge. They had to trust in their plan, in each other, and in their own determination to see it through. Section 4, Into the Unknown. The shaft was cramped, a claustrophobic's nightmare. John inched forward, the metal biting into his skin. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the rasp of his own breath and the frantic thumping of his heart. Fear, cold and clammy, wrapped around him like a shroud. He didn't know how long he crawled. Time had lost all meaning in this subterranean labyrinth. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he pushed on, driven by a desperate hope for freedom. A faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance, a beacon in the endless darkness. John's spirit soared. Could it be? Could they actually make it? As he drew closer, the light revealed a rusted ladder leading up into the unknown. He glanced back at Sal, his face pale and streaked with grime, but his eyes held a glimmer of hope. They had come so far. Freedom was within reach. Section 5. Whispers in the Dark. The title alone sent chills down John's spine, a premonition of the horrors that awaited them in the depths below. John climbed the ladder, each clang of metal echoing through the silence like a death knell. The rungs were cold and slick with moisture, making each step a precarious endeavour. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, as if the very air was thick with unseen eyes watching his every move. He emerged into a vast, cavernous space, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul and ancient. The walls seemed to close in around him, their rough, uneven surfaces glistening with a thin layer of moisture. It was as if the cavern itself was alive, breathing in tandem with his own laboured breaths. He helped Sal through the opening, and together they stood, blinking in the dim light. The faint glow from their flashlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. They exchanged a glance, both knowing that turning back was not an option. This part of the prison was abandoned, forgotten, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. The remnants of old cells and rusted bars stood as silent witnesses to the horrors that had once transpired here. The walls seemed to whisper secrets of pain and suffering, their voices lost to time, but still echoing faintly in the stillness. But the silence wasn't empty. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with whispers, faint and unsettling. The voices seemed to come from all directions, a cacophony of hushed tones that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand on end. It was filled with whispers, faint and unsettling. They seemed to speak of things long forgotten, of ancient rites and dark rituals performed in the bowels of the earth. John strained to make out the words, but they remained just out of reach, tantalizingly close, yet maddeningly elusive. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing on the damp stone floor. Each step seemed to reverberate through the cavern, a reminder of their intrusion into this forsaken place. The ground beneath their feet was uneven and treacherous, forcing them to move slowly and carefully. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, shifting and moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing moment, the chill seeping into their bones and making their breath visible in the dim light. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen lurked in the darkness, its eyes fixed on their every move. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadowy figure darting out of sight. The sensation of being hunted was palpable, a constant gnawing fear that gnawed at his resolve. A sudden noise, a scraping sound from the darkness, sent shivers down his spine. It was a harsh, grating sound like metal against stone, and it seemed to come from just ahead. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest, as he strained to see what lay beyond the reach of their lights. He spun around, his heart racing. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating and oppressive. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. The words seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the darkness. He could barely hear his own voice over the sound of his pounding heart. Sal shook his head, his eyes wide with apprehension. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was palpable, a living, breathing thing that seemed to wrap itself around them, squeezing the air from their lungs. "I don't know," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the sound of their own breathing. The words were a stark reminder of their vulnerability, of the unknown dangers that lurked in the shadows. "But we need to keep moving." The determination in his voice was clear, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. They had come too far to turn back now. With a final resolute nod, they pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the cavern as they ventured deeper into the unknown.